Just a couple of weeks ago, LangChain announced that it raised $125 million to build the platform for agentic engineering. And they made this bold statement that LLMs will change what applications can do, but the real power comes from turning LLM applications into agents with access to data and APIs. And they're saying that we are seeing the rise of new discipline called agent engineering, where building reliable agents requires a new approach, one that combines product engineering and data science thinking. And it's the iterative process of refining non-deterministic LLMs into reliable experiences. And once again, they're reiterating that they're building the platform for agent engineering. That led to the release of LangChain version 1.0, which is the new version. It is focused, production-ready foundation for building agents. They have streamlined the framework into three main components, which is that, create agent, standard content blocks, and simplified namespace. So these are the three main modifications, or these are the three main categories in which we can group the changes in LangChain v1. So in this video, let's look into LangChain 1.0. and find out what are the new concepts that we need to know in order to learn this new regime of building agents with LangChain. And so let's look into the release notes of 1.0 to see what has changed. And let's also look into how we can go about starting to code in 1.0 rather than the previous version. So let's start with create agent now. Prior to LangChain 1.0, creating agents, creating a basic agent such as a React agent was part of the LangGraph framework. So we had to do langgraph.prebuilt.create React agent. But with LangChain 1.0, they have moved it to a separate package called agents under LangChain. So now you have to do from langchain.agents import create agent, and that will create a React agent. So in my previous videos, we have discussed about React agents a lot. Basically, we have a model and the model has access to tools, and the model can iterate between the tool, and this loop can execute as many times as the model wants. And eventually, when the model has the answer, it gets back to us with a result. So that's a high-level React agent. So we can see that we need the model and the tools. So that's precisely what we do. We create agent by passing the model and the list of tools that it needs, and we provide a system prompt, and boom, we have the agent created for us. We can straight away invoke the agent with our message and we get the result. So this is much more simpler syntax compared to what we used to do previously. And so while we create agents like this, they have introduced the new concept of middleware that is specific to LangChain 1.0 again. So it was not there before LangChain 1.0. They've given a separate page dedicated to what the middleware is. Let's look into what the middleware is. I've simplified it a lot, but still this is the idea. Basically, before the introduction of middleware, we had the user query the LLM. It goes straight to the LLM and the LLM does whatever it wants and it can respond back. But with the middleware, as the name suggests, whenever we get data from the user, the middleware sits in the middle between the user and the LLM, and it can be used to inspect the data, play around with it, or you can basically do context engineering, because you now have all the data and you can do some sort of summarization here, pass the summary to the LLM rather than pass whatever you get from the user, or maybe from another API here, or it could be another LLM here. It could be anything here that's giving you the data, but the middleware has the potential to kind of digest that information. So it can even censor sensitive information. For example, if the user gives his email or her email, in the middleware, you can implement the logic to kind of remove the email and pass the other details to the LLM. So that is what the middleware does. And they have given some pre-built middlewares. So one is to redact sensitive information, which is the personal identifiable information middleware. And as the name suggests, it's used to redact personal information when you're passing it to the LLM. And we have summarization middleware. This is where you can condense the conversation. You can play around with whatever the data that you have already so that you can do some sort of a context engineering here. And we have human in the loop. As the name suggests, whenever the information needs to be approved by the human, you can use this middleware. So all the middleware goes under langchain.agents.middleware. You can import the pre-built ones, and you can define what you're actually redacting. For example, if it's the email, you could say strategy is redact, and you can redact that personal information. And you can do the same with, say, phone number, or you could ask summarization before it's passed to the model. So for the summarization, obviously you need a different model. So you can say that use this model and summarize the data and restrict the summary to max token of, say, 500. And you can also use human in the loop. You can say that interrupt, send email, and allow decisions, approve, edit, or reject. And you can plug in this middleware before the data is actually digested by the LLM. And you can even build custom middleware. Obviously, on top of these three pre-built ones, you can build your own custom middleware. So at each step of the agent execution, the middleware gives control by using hooks. Basically, middleware is a hook. So we have before model, and we have before agent, we have after model, and we have wrap tool call. So whenever we want the middleware to be executed in a before a tool call or in a before a model execution, we could just use those hooks and we can implement a middleware. So these are the hooks that are available. So before agent, before model, wrap model call, wrap tool call, after model, and after agents. Let's say if you use the hook before agent, and it will run before calling the agent. And the use cases, for example, load memory. So you may want to load something from the memory and pass it on to the agent. So you can use the before agent hook, load from the memory, and pass the detail into the agent before invoking the agent, so on and so forth for the different ones. And you can even build your own custom middleware. Let's see how that could be done. We need to import agent middleware, and we need to import the model request again from agents.middleware. And you need to inherit from the agent middleware and create your, in this case, it's the expertise-based model middleware. You need to write your hook basically as a function. And whenever you're creating the agent, you can now pass an object of the middleware that you just created. And that is how you can create your own custom middleware. And they've given a complete guide on the middleware, so we can always go through that if you want in-depth reference whenever you are implementing a middleware. So once you've implemented once you have created your agent, you implemented it, you use it, and you get a response. That is where this standard block comes, which is the next novelty of the LangChain version 1. In standard content block, they have introduced a new content block property that provides unified access to modern LLM features across providers. So the key is across providers. So to understand what this means, let's look into an example from their blog itself. Just to give you an idea, so these are the different model providers that LangChain supports. We have Anthropic, OpenAI, and we have Ollama models, and we also have Google's ecosystem. So one of the challenges of supporting so many providers is that the response from each provider is a bit different. And so LangChain has to deal with that. So prior to the introduction of content block property, let's say we are initializing a chat model, and it's the Anthropic model, and we've got the thinking enabled. And we are binding these tools. We are invoking it, asking the question, when was LangChain created? And we get the response, and the content is there in the content property. And this is the structure of the content property. Note that this is the structure of Anthropic's response. Let's do the same thing with OpenAI now. So we're initializing the model. The model now is GPT-5 Nano. And we are binding the tools, getting the response, and look at the content. It's quite different. For example, we've got type reasoning, and we've got summary and ID. But in case of Anthropic, it says type thinking, then there's thinking and the signature. And, this kind of thing creates more and more problem as you have models from different providers working together. So what they have now introduced is the new content blocks property. So now what you do is response.content blocks, and you have a standard structure for the response, and this is agnostic of the provider. So you will always have the type as reasoning, and you will have the reasoning, and you will have the type as web search call, and you will have the query ID and extras. So this is the basic structure whenever you use the content blocks. So with the content blocks, obviously they have standardized how the response looks, and so it becomes agnostic to the provider. It doesn't matter which provider that you use, which model you use, you invoke, and the content block always has the type as reasoning. So that's the benefit. Basically, it becomes provider agnostic all of a sudden, and it also becomes type safe because full type hints are all context block types. And the good thing is it's backward compatible. So if you want to dive deeper into understanding content blocks, they've also given a guide here. I'll give the link for that content blocks guide in the description. Moving on to the third novelty, or the third change, major change in 1.0, it's going to be that of simplified namespace. So they're saying that the namespace has now been streamlined to focus on essential building blocks for agents. So because the focus is now shifted to agents, the namespace has been changed accordingly. Legacy functionality has been moved to LangChain Classic. So I will get to that when we look into the migration guide, and we will look into the code basically. So let's now look into the simplified namespace, or the simplified packages. They basically streamline the LangChain package namespaces to focus essentially on the building blocks, which are agents now. So the restructuring is more to do with the pivot to agents. And so they have exposed these namespaces, which are quite concise and precise. For example, you have LangChain agents, you have messages, tools, chat models, and embeddings. And what's available under that? With agents, you have create agent and agent state to access the agent state at any point in time. And with the messages, obviously we have content block, we saw these. And then we have trim messages, we have tool and base tool. Similarly with chat models, you can initialize the chat model, and we have base chat model. And with embeddings, obviously we have the init embeddings, and have openly said that they have re-exported from LangChain core, which gives you a focused API surface for building agents. So they basically restructured LangChain core in order to focus more on agents, and these are to building agents. For example, you import this to build agents, you import LangChain messages for content and messages, and you import tools, and for the models you do init chat model and init embeddings. So with that, we can move on to the migration guide. So the migration guide gives us quick code snippets as to what was before V1 and what is now V1. For example, we have the V0 old and V1. So let's look at some of these comparisons to understand what we can expect from V1. Like I said before, the packages are now simplified. We have agents, messages, tools, chat models, and embeddings. And then there's LangChain Classic. So if you have been using LangChain packages, you need to install LangChain Classic now. What I mean is the LLM chain and conversation chain, and all these are now part of the LangChain Classic. The retrievers and the indexing APIs, the hub, which used to be the open source contribution for anything, and even the LangChain community. So this is all now part of Classic. So previously you used to do LangChain.change, import LangChain. Now with V1, you have to do LangChain Classic, change, import LLM chain. Similarly, for retrievers, we need to do LangChain Classic.retrievers, LangChain Classic.indexes, and LangChain Classic for importing hub as well. And it's a separate package now. So either we need to do pip install LangChain Classic, or we need to use UV to install LangChain Classic. And the create agent, we spoke enough about it in the beginning. So previously it used to be from pre-built, we need to import create React agent. Now it's LangChain.agents, import create agent. So similarly with the prompts, for the static prompt renaming, with V0, what we used to do is, so whenever we used to create React agent, we used to pass the prompt as one of the parameters for create React agent. Now it's going to be specific, and it now becomes system prompt. So you need to say system prompt, and you are a helpful AI assistant. So if you're passing a system message, we just had prompt. So we say we wrap our content in system message. Now we have the system prompt, so you can directly pass prompt is you are a helpful assistant. Then we have dynamic prompts. So if you want to do dynamic prompts, which is one of the easiest ways to do context engineering, let's take the example where you want to dynamically prompt based on the user role. So if the user role is expert, then you use this prompt. But if the user role is a beginner, then you use this prompt. So previously what we used to do is write a function that returns one of these prompts based on the user role, where user role is one of the strings in a data class. And whenever you're creating your React agent, you pass the dynamic prompt to the prompt parameter. Now what has changed is this one now gets a decorator. So if you go to v1, we can see that the dynamic prompt function now gets a decorator. So you need to decorate it with dynamic prompt, and the data class still remains the same. You need to pass the dynamic prompt to the middleware. Now, whenever you're creating an agent, you need to pass the dynamic prompt as one of the items in the list that you pass as the middleware. So the middleware obviously could be many, and we have seen them earlier in the video what that is. So that was dynamic prompts, and we have this pre and post model hooks. In v0, we used to have the pre-model hook parameter, and then we pass a function that takes care of, let's say, summarization. With v1, obviously we have the luxury of middleware now, so we have a list within which we can pass a list of middleware that we need to take care of. Same with the post model hook. We have the middleware where we can pass our hook. The next change is to do with the custom states for your agents. So what we have to do now is use the state schema parameter whenever we want custom state to be accessed by any of the tools. So previously what we used to do is use inject state, and we used to have our schema for the custom state, but then we had to use annotated and use the injected schema, and we had to access the username like this. But in the newer version, we can access it using runtime.state.get and the schema. Then we should be able to get anything in your schema basically. So that's the change to custom state. And the next beauty of middleware is that middleware can also define custom states by setting the state schema attribute. If you're setting the state schema to custom state, you create a middleware by passing the custom state. And so the middleware with the custom state can be passed as the parameter, as one of the middlewares to the middleware parameter whenever you are creating the agent. So you can leverage middleware also for that. So if you want to do dynamic model selection, for example, if you want to use a more advanced model for long conversation, so previously we used to have a simple function and write the logic inside that. And whenever we are creating the agent, we pass the select model, but we don't have to stick to that now. We can use the middleware for it. For example, we have the agent middleware. And so we can create a dynamic model middleware, which inherits from agent middleware. And we can initialize it with the message threshold. And we can basically write the logic for it in a, say, wrap model call. And we can pass the dynamic model middleware as one of the middlewares to the middleware parameter. So this way, middleware takes care of most of these stuff. And when it comes to tools, previously we used to have this tool node, which was part of the LangGraph. We used to wrap all the tools in a tool node. Now we can just pass as a list to the tools, and it's taken care of. And when it comes to the structured outputs, they have also introduced two structured output strategies. One is the tool strategy, and the next one is the provider strategy. So previously what we used to do is we pass the response format and we define a schema, and we pass the schema directly to the response format saying that, this is the schema and this is how the structured output should look like. Now what happens is you basically use the tool strategy, you wrap your output schema in tool strategy and pass it to the response format. I don't know what's the advantage of this one though. If you guys know what the advantage is, you can leave a comment. The next change is to that of the context. So you can have dynamic context or you can have static context. So with the static context, what we used to do in the previous version is just pass that as a config So the user ID and session ID is more static and doesn't change throughout the execution. But with V1, we can pass that as a context. So we have this data class, we create this schema, and we set the values for the schema and pass that as context to the agent whenever we are invoking it. So that's one difference. So in the standard content, we obviously have the content blocks, which we saw previously. So they've just shown an example of how we can read the content using the content block. Similarly, we can create multimodal messages using, the type. The way we define images is changed slightly. So we used to say type image URL and then pass the image URL. But now we have the type image and we just pass the URL like this. And they've also given the different examples for the block shapes. We can have text block, we can have image block. So if you want further details about content blocks, obviously there's a reference which has all the details to it. In terms of the simplified packages, again, we saw what are the different packages that have been simplified. It's agents, messages, tools, chat models, and embeddings. And LangChain Classic, again, it's a separate package now with all the, so we need to use pip install for it. And they've also mentioned about some breaking changes that have been dropped. And one of the main thing is that if you're in Python 3.9 or before, it's no longer supported. So you now require Python 3.10 or higher. So those are the kind of major changes. And then they have listed a few minor changes like, AI message chunk, language model output where, the logic for merging message chunks, and now open files with UTF encoding, or these are some minor changes. So that pretty much wraps up our video on LangChain 1.0. I hope you guys found that useful, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.